What if I told you there's a US state where you can drive south and end up in Canada, where a doctor invented breakfast cereal specifically to kill your sex drive, where a city declared war on its neighbor and nobody even got a paper cut, and where hell is a real town that freezes over every single winter? And that's not even the weird part? Michigan is the most absurd, unhinged, and historically insane state in America, and we found 71 dumbest things to prove it. Smash that hype button right now. Every hype shoots this video to someone who still thinks Michigan is just a mitten. 1. Michigan is the only state in the entire country built like a bad real estate decision. The Lower Peninsula sits down south like a proud mitten, and the Upper Peninsula floats up north like it forgot to stay connected. And these two chunks of land never physically touch each other at any single point. No bridge, no land crossing, nothing. Just open water staring awkwardly between them. Every other state manages to stay in one piece, but Michigan looked at geography and said absolutely not. 2. Michigan decided it could not wait for the rest of America to get serious about alcohol. In 1916, the state passed its own full prohibition law, a whole 4 years before the national ban even existed. Then, the most ironic thing happened. Michigan turned around and became one of the biggest bootlegging corridors in the entire country. Illegal liquor was flowing through Michigan faster than the state could pretend to care. Michigan banned the party, and then immediately became the party's most reliable delivery driver. 3. Michigan held 2 simultaneous official governor inaugurations in 1835, because 2 men both decided the election belonged to them. Stevens Mason and his opponent both showed up on the same day, both took the oath, and both started governing like the other one simply did not exist. The state of Michigan had 2 functioning governors walking around at the same time giving orders, and nobody had a clear answer about which one was actually legal. It was democracy working exactly as the Founding Fathers never intended. 4. Ford engineers sat down with calculators and worked out something truly disturbing about the Pinto. The fuel tank would explode in rear collisions, and they knew it. They ran the numbers comparing the cost of fixing every single car versus simply paying out lawsuit settlements to crash victims. And the settlement option came out cheaper on paper, so Ford chose that path. That cold, internal memo eventually went fully public and became one of the most damning corporate documents in American business history. 5. Michigan and Ohio declared an actual border war against each other in 1835 over a strip of land near Toledo. Both sides sent militias. Governors made furious speeches. The whole country watched waiting for blood to spill. Then absolutely nothing happened. Not one confirmed shot was fired in the entire conflict. Not a single person died in combat. The most dramatic border dispute in Midwest history ended with both sides going home and Michigan getting the Upper Peninsula as a consolation prize instead. 6. Detroit was genuinely called the Paris of the Midwest in the early 1900s, and the nickname was not sarcastic at all. And the architecture was stunning, the money was flowing, and the city felt like the cultural crown of America. Then decades passed and things changed dramatically. By the 1970s, that same city held the highest per capita arson rate in the entire United States. Detroit went from being compared to the most beautiful city in Europe to being compared to a controlled demolition site. 7. The British pulled off one of the cleanest military victories of the War of 1812 at Fort Mackinac without even breaking a sweat. They showed up and informed the American commander that war had been declared. The American commander had absolutely no idea because nobody had told Michigan yet. He looked around at his outnumbered garrison, thought about it carefully, and handed the fort over without firing a single shot. Michigan lost its own military fort before it even knew there was a fight happening. 8. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes in Battle Creek, Michigan, and the origin story is not what anyone expects at a breakfast table. Kellogg ran a sanitarium and was obsessed with controlling the urges of his patients. He believed bland, boring food would reduce sexual impulses in the human body. Cornflakes was his clinical solution to that specific medical problem. The documented and stated goal of America's most famous breakfast cereal was to make people less interested in physical desire. 9. Standing in Michigan and looking south across the water, a person is actually staring directly into Canada. Michigan is the only state in the entire country where a foreign nation sits due south of part of its own land. Every American grows up with a mental map placing Canada somewhere above and to the north. Michigan completely destroys that assumption. Windsor, Ontario sits directly south of Detroit in a geographical arrangement that confuses virtually every person who hears it for the very first time. 10. Michigan had a law on the books making it a criminal offense to swear in front of women or children. That law did not quietly disappear after a few years. It survived legal challenge after legal challenge for over 100 years, while attorneys kept arguing about whether bad language near a minor was genuinely a prosecutable crime. Courts kept finding reasons to keep it alive, until finally in 2002 a judge struck it down for good. Michigan criminalized cursing and enforced that position for an entire century. 11. Now, Michigan politicians drew congressional districts so twisted and convoluted that actual court filings described them as resembling a Tetris game gone wrong. These were not minor boundary adjustments or small geographic compromises. These were deliberately engineered shapes that snaked through neighborhoods, split communities down the middle, and connected completely unrelated areas through tiny corridors. Lawyers stood in federal courtrooms holding maps that looked like someone had a seizure while drawing state lines. Michigan gerrymandering became so legendary, it required a video game comparison to explain it to a judge. 12. General Motors did not just lose money before its 2009 bankruptcy. It burned through $82 billion in cash like a company actively trying to set a record. When the wreckage was finally counted, it stood as the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. Then came the part that made taxpayers everywhere grip their armrests. The federal government stepped in with a full bailout to keep the company alive. GM managed to burn the largest pile of industrial cash ever recorded and still needed someone else to pay the final bill. 13. Lake Michigan has rip currents running beneath its surface that kill swimmers every single summer with brutal consistency. These currents pull people under faster than most beachgoers ever expect from a freshwater lake. For decades, the state had no standardized public warning system in place to alert swimmers about current conditions on any given beach day. People arrived at the shore with no reliable information. Walked into the water and some of them never came back. Michigan had one of the deadliest recreational water hazards in America and treated warnings as optional. 14. Flint, Michigan needed to save money in 2014, so officials made a decision that would destroy the city's reputation permanently. They switched the water supply source, and almost immediately residents noticed something wrong with what was coming out of their taps. The water was corroding pipes and pulling lead directly into the drinking supply of an entire city. Children were being poisoned. State officials told residents the water was fine, while internal documents showed they knew otherwise. Flint became the defining American example of a government poisoning its own people to cut a budget line. 15. Michigan sent soldiers to the Civil War at a rate that put most northern states to shame. The commitment looked heroic on paper. Meanwhile, back home inside Michigan's own copper mines, children as young as 8 years old were working underground shifts alongside adult laborers. The state was simultaneously celebrated for its patriotic sacrifice and quietly running child labor operations in its most profitable industry. Michigan marched off to fight a war about human dignity while practicing a version of exploitation inside its own borders. 16. Detroit has 2 Coney Island hot dog restaurants sitting practically next to each other, and they have been locked in a feud since 1917. Lafayette Coney Island and American Coney Island face off across the same block, and their loyalists treat the rivalry with the intensity of a religious disagreement. The baffling part is that neither restaurant has anything to do with Coney Island in New York. The dish itself is a Detroit invention with Greek immigrant roots. Michigan built an entire civic identity around a food fight over something that was never what its name claimed. 17. The Mackinac Bridge opened in 1957 as the longest suspension bridge on the entire planet at that moment in history. Engineers built it to finally connect Michigan's 2 peninsulas across the Straits of Mackinac. It was a genuine engineering marvel that made international news. Then came the irony. The majority of Michigan residents living in the Lower Peninsula have never actually crossed that bridge in their lifetime. Michigan built the world's greatest bridge to reach a part of its own state that most of its own people never bother visiting. 18. Michigan law in the 1900s drew a very specific and completely absurd line around alcohol consumption. Getting drunk on a train was a criminal offense under state law. Getting equally drunk on a Lake Michigan passenger ferry was perfectly legal. Travelers figured this out quickly. Ferry routes became the celebrated legal loophole for anyone who wanted to drink freely without risking arrest. Michigan accidentally created a floating party circuit by making one form of transportation dry and leaving the other one entirely unregulated on open water. 19. Michigan moved its state capital from Detroit to Lansing in 1847, and the choice of Lansing made almost no logical sense at the time. Lansing was barely a settlement. It had almost nothing in terms of infrastructure, population, or government facilities. The reason legislators chose it anyway was genuinely embarrassing. Several of them sincerely believed Detroit sat too close to the Canadian border and was dangerously exposed to a potential military invasion. Michigan relocated its entire seat of government because politicians were afraid Canada might attack Detroit. 20. Detroit's auto industry gave the world the moving assembly line and immediately revealed what it planned to do with that power. Factory managers used the new system to push workers at speeds that human bodies were never designed to maintain for an 8-hour shift. But the pace was relentless, the brakes were minimal, and the pressure was constant. Workers eventually hit their breaking point, and Michigan saw one of America's earliest and most intense large-scale industrial labor riots erupt directly on the factory floor. The assembly line invented modern manufacturing and modern labor rebellion at the same time. 21. Michigan has more inland lakes than Minnesota, and that fact deserves to sit with everyone for a moment. Minnesota built its entire state identity around water. The license plates say, "Land of 10,000 lakes." The tourism campaigns never let anyone forget it. Michigan quietly holds more inland lakes than Minnesota does and receives almost none of the credit or recognition for it. Minnesota claimed the water brand and the whole country accepted it without question. Lake Michigan has been sitting on a superior lake count for decades, while another state takes all the glory. 22. Detroit was being celebrated across the entire country in 1943 as the arsenal of democracy. Factories were running around the clock producing war materials. The city felt like the beating industrial heart of America fighting fascism. Then, in the middle of all that national pride, Detroit erupted into one of the deadliest race riots in American history. 34 people died over 3 days of violence. The city, making weapons to defend democracy abroad, was simultaneously unable to provide basic safety and dignity to its own black residents at home. 23. Michigan's Upper Peninsula copper mines made the region the wealthiest place per capita in the entire United States during their peak years. Money was flowing, where towns were booming and the future looked permanent. Then the copper ran out. It did not decline gradually over generations, giving people time to adjust and plan. Entire towns collapsed almost overnight. Populations vanished. Buildings were abandoned mid-use. The wealthiest region in America per capita transformed into a landscape of ghost towns in what felt like a single economic exhale. 24. Battle Creek, Michigan once had more competing cereal companies packed into one small city than anywhere else on Earth. These were not friendly business neighbors sharing a market. They were men waging a deeply personal war over the American breakfast table. Each company believed it alone understood what the country should eat every single morning. Millions of dollars, aggressive advertising, and genuine personal animosity fueled the competition. A quiet Michigan town became the most fiercely contested battleground in the history of food, simply because a few obsessed men refused to share the cereal aisle. 25. Hell, Michigan is a real town with a real mayor and a legitimate place on official Michigan maps. It freezes over completely every single winter without exception. This means the phrase, "when hell freezes over," is not a figure of speech in Michigan. It is a weather forecast. Local residents have built an entire small tourism economy around the annual event of their town, literally freezing solid. People drive to hell specifically to watch it freeze and take photographs proving it happened. Michigan accidentally made the world's most famous hypothetical expression into a dependable seasonal attraction. 26. Michigan once had a law specifically making it illegal to paint a sparrow and sell it as a parakeet. The fact that this law needed to exist at all tells a story more alarming than the law itself. This was not a hypothetical edge case that cautious legislators invented to cover future possibilities. This bird fraud scam was happening in Michigan, frequently enough and consistently enough that the state legislature looked at the situation and decided a dedicated law was the appropriate response. Someone in Michigan was running a painted sparrow operation at serious enough scale to require legislation. 27. Michigan voters went to the polls in 1916 and rejected women's right to vote in a direct referendum. The majority said no clearly and officially. Then 4 years later, the 19th Amendment passed at the national level, and Michigan had no choice but to comply, regardless of what its own voters had decided. The women of Michigan received the right to vote not because Michigan granted it willingly, but because the rest of the country overruled the state's own democratic decision. Michigan's voters chose wrong and got corrected by the nation. 28. The Packard automotive plant in Detroit was once the most technologically advanced factory on the entire planet. Engineers and industrialists from around the world traveled to Detroit specifically to study how Packard built things. Then, in 1958, the plant closed. Nobody bought it. Nobody repurposed it. Nobody demolished it. It just sat there, completely abandoned, while the city changed around it. For 60 years, the most advanced factory on Earth quietly crumbled into one of the largest urban ruins anywhere in the world. Detroit left its crown jewel to rot in plain sight. 29. Lake Superior is so brutally cold at its depths that wooden ships sunk during the 1800s are still sitting on the bottom in remarkable condition today. The freezing temperatures preserved the hulls, the cargo holds, and even the rigging on some wrecks. Divers can swim down and look directly at vessels that went under more than a century ago with their structures still largely intact. Lake Superior did not just swallow those ships. It kept them perfectly stored like a cold, dark underwater museum that nobody ever planned or paid for. 30. Michigan has more registered recreational boats per capita than Florida. Florida is a state literally shaped by its coastline and built around the idea of being permanently on the water. Michigan spends roughly 5 months of every year completely frozen and inaccessible by water in large portions of the state. The lakes lock up, the marina slips sit empty, and the boats go into storage. Then spring arrives, and Michigan somehow still outboats Florida on a per-person basis. Michigan is the most enthusiastic fair-weather boating state in the country by a significant margin. 31. Detroit's position directly across the river from Canada during Prohibition turned the city into something it never officially advertised. The water crossing was short, the demand was massive, and the opportunity was impossible to ignore. Detroit became the 4th largest port of entry for illegal alcohol in the entire United States. Bootlegging grew so large and so organized that it became the city's 2nd biggest industry behind auto manufacturing. Michigan was simultaneously producing cars legally and importing liquor illegally, and both operations were running at impressive industrial scale at the same time. 32. Michigan's Upper Peninsula has been fighting about a meat pie for generations and shows absolutely no signs of stopping. The Cornish pasty arrived with immigrant miners from England and became a cultural institution in the UP. Then, somebody started putting ketchup on it. Traditional pasty loyalists reacted like a crime had been committed. The ketchup faction refused to back down. This argument has been running hot for decades in a region where the original dish came from Cornwall, England, where ketchup was never part of the recipe under any historical circumstance whatsoever. 33. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan sits so far removed from the rest of the state that it is geographically closer to the capital cities of 7 other American states than it is to Lansing. Michigan's own capital city is farther away from part of Michigan than the capitals of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and several other states are. Residents of the UP have pointed this out for decades as evidence that Lansing governs them from a distance that makes genuine representation almost geographically impossible. The UP is technically Michigan, but practically somewhere else entirely on every map. 34. Michigan was the first state in the entire country to pave a rural road with concrete back in 1909. That is a legitimate piece of American infrastructure history that Michigan can genuinely claim. Then, something remarkable happened over the following century. Michigan proceeded to complain about its roads more loudly, more consistently, and more passionately than any other state in the Union. The state that invented the paved road became the state most associated with potholes, crumbling infrastructure, and drivers swerving around damage. Michigan pioneered road paving and then perfected road suffering. 35. Michigan launched the Pure Michigan Tourism Campaign and spent tens of millions in taxpayer dollars, annually turning the state into a brand. The advertisements were beautiful. The voiceovers were calming. The imagery was stunning. The campaign ran at full budget while state officials were simultaneously standing in front of cameras telling Flint residents that the water coming out of their taps was completely safe to drink. Michigan was marketing itself as a pristine natural paradise to the outside world while poisoning a city of its own residents from the inside at the exact same time. 36. Flint, Michigan was once the highest per capita income city in the United States. General Motors put it there. The factories ran full shifts, the paychecks were substantial, and Flint felt like proof that industrial America worked exactly as promised. Then, GM relocated its operations and the math reversed completely. The same city that sat at the top of the American income chart descended into one of the poorest large cities in the country. See, Flint's entire economic identity was built on one company, and when that company left, it took everything Flint had built with it. 37. Michigan applies road salt every winter at volumes that would seem excessive, even to people who have never seen a Michigan winter. The salt keeps roads drivable, but it travels far beyond the pavement. Over time, it contaminated hundreds of private residential water wells sitting near state highways across Michigan. Families turned on their taps and got the slow-moving consequences of decades of aggressive salting. This environmental contamination spread quietly across the state and received almost no national media attention, while far more publicized environmental stories dominated the news cycle everywhere else. 38. The residents of Michigan's Thumb region take their geographic and cultural separateness extremely seriously. The Thumb is the mitten-shaped peninsula jutting up from the lower peninsula's eastern side, and the people living there consider themselves meaningfully distinct from the rest of Michigan. They resist being grouped with other Michiganders in conversation, in regional identity, and in cultural association. It is a corner of a state that already has an identity crisis, deciding it needs its own separate identity within that crisis. Michigan contains multitudes, including a thumb that refuses to be part of the hand. 39. Michigan's emergency manager law gave the state government the power to dissolve elected local governments and replace chosen officials with state-appointed managers. Voters looked at that law and rejected it in a direct referendum. The legislature looked at what voters decided and reenacted the same law just weeks later. The people said no through the official democratic process, and the legislature responded by passing the thing again almost immediately. The same law that voters struck down through a referendum was sitting back on the books before the year was even finished. 40. Tom Monahan was running a small pizza shop in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and needed his partner out of the business. His partner wanted cash, but Monahan had no cash. What he did have was a Volkswagen Beetle. He traded his half ownership of the car for full control of the pizza shop, and his partner walked away satisfied with that deal. That pizza shop became Domino's. Domino's became a global empire worth billions of dollars. The partner who took the Volkswagen traded what would have been a multi-billion-dollar stake for a used car and drove away. 41. Mackinac Island banned all automobiles in 1898 and has enforced that ban without a single exception ever since. No cars, no trucks, no motorized vehicles of any kind are allowed on the island today. Transportation runs entirely on horses and bicycles. That decision sounds charming and historic until the practical reality sets in. The island's single most persistent and expensive infrastructure challenge in the 21st century is managing horse manure. Michigan's most beloved tourist destination spends serious municipal money and planning energy dealing with the inevitable output of its entire transportation system. 42. Michigan passed a wolf hunting law in 2014, and what followed was one of the most exhausting legislative loops in state history. The law passed through the legislature. Voters challenged it and overturned it in a public referendum. The legislature looked at what voters decided and passed the same wolf hunting law again. All of this happened within a single calendar year. Michigan managed to pass, kill, and resurrect the exact same wildlife hunting law 3 separate times in 12 months. The wolves survived the confusion. The voters learned that winning a referendum in Michigan is only temporary. 43. Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick was already under an active federal criminal investigation when Detroit voters went to the polls and re-elected him anyway. The investigation was not a secret. It was being covered in the news, and voters returned him to office regardless, and he continued governing while federal prosecutors continued building their case. The case eventually concluded with Kilpatrick sentenced to 28 years in federal prison for corruption charges. Detroit elected a man to lead the city a second time, while the federal government was actively preparing to send him away for nearly 3 decades. 44. Michigan was the leading producer of salt in the entire United States during the late 1800s. Underground brine deposits running beneath the state were extracted in massive quantities, and Michigan supplied salt to markets across the country. This was a dominant industrial operation that shaped the state's economy in ways that left a permanent geographic and geological mark. As in today, the overwhelming majority of Michigan residents have no idea this ever happened. One of Michigan's most significant historical industries has been almost completely erased from the state's own collective memory and popular identity. 45. Pictured rocks on Lake Superior served as a critical navigation landmark for explorers and sailors moving through the Great Lakes for 400 consecutive years. The towering colored sandstone cliffs were one of the most recognizable features on the entire inland sea. Then someone looked at those cliffs and saw a commercial stone quarry instead of a landmark. The plan to demolish pictured rocks for building material nearly moved forward before opposition finally stopped it. See, Michigan came remarkably close to destroying a 4th-century navigational treasure and one of its most stunning natural formations for construction aggregate. 46. Michigan is the only state in American history to lose total population across 3 consecutive national censuses. Every 10 years, the country counts its people, and every 10 years, Michigan comes back with fewer residents than it had before. Other states have declined. Other states have struggled. Michigan turned population loss into a consistent multi-decade pattern that no other state has matched. People are leaving, and the departures are not random fluctuations. They are a sustained directional trend that has now persisted long enough to become one of the defining statistical facts of modern Michigan. 47. Little Caesars founder Mike Ehrlich discovered that Rosa Parks was living in Detroit under conditions that put her safety at genuine risk. He quietly began paying her rent so she could stay in the city without that threat hanging over her daily life. He told nobody. He made no announcements. He sought no recognition or publicity for what he was doing. Rosa Parks lived more safely in Detroit because of Mike Ehrlich, and the public only learned about it after both of them had died. One of the most generous quiet acts in Detroit history happened completely in secret. 48. The Keweenaw Peninsula sticks so far out into Lake Superior that it puts itself directly in the path of weather systems that most of Michigan never experiences at the same intensity. And the result is snowfall totals that stack up higher than most parts of Alaska on an average annual basis. Alaska is a state defined globally by its extreme cold and winter conditions. The Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan's Upper Peninsula outsnows most of it regularly. Michigan contains a geographic peninsula that competes with Alaska for snowfall, and most Americans have never heard the name Keweenaw in their lives. 49. Michigan passed a law requiring every hotel in the state to display a printed copy of the full state criminal code inside every single guest room. The thinking behind this requirement apparently assumed that travelers checking into Michigan hotels would read through the state's complete legal statutes and make informed decisions about compliance. Guests arrived, found the document, and made their own choices about whether to engage with it. Michigan's approach to crime prevention in its hospitality industry was essentially to leave a legal pamphlet on the nightstand and trust that tourists would govern themselves accordingly. 50. Michigan voters in 2018 bypassed the state legislature entirely and created an independent redistricting commission through a direct ballot initiative. They did this because both political parties had spent over 50 consecutive years aggressively gerrymandering districts with complete impunity and zero accountability to the people living inside those twisted boundaries. No lawsuit had fixed it. No election had fixed it. No legislative effort had fixed it. Voters finally decided the only solution was to remove the politicians from the process altogether and hand the maps to an independent body. Michigan fixed gerrymandering by making politicians legally irrelevant to it. 51. GM executive Alfred Sloan sat in Michigan in the 1920s and invented one of the most psychologically manipulative business strategies in American commercial history. He called it planned obsolescence, and the concept was simple and ruthless. Cars were deliberately engineered to look unfashionable after a few years, even when they still ran perfectly well. The goal was to make owners feel social embarrassment about their current vehicle so they would feel pressure to buy a new one. Sloan did not just sell cars, he engineered the feeling that whatever car you owned was already becoming something to be ashamed of. 52. Michigan's lake effect snow operates on a geographic scale so precise and so localized that it produces outcomes that seem statistically impossible. Two towns sitting just 10 miles apart can receive completely different snowfall totals from the exact same storm system on the exact same day. One town gets 3 feet. The neighboring town gets a dusting. The same clouds passing over the same region drop their entire payload on one side of an invisible atmospheric line and leave the other side almost untouched. Michigan weather does not just vary by region. It varies by neighborhood on any given winter morning. 53. Yoopers are what people in Michigan's Upper Peninsula call themselves, and the name alone signals that something linguistically separate is happening up there. Academic linguists who study North American regional dialects have officially classified the way Yoopers speak as a distinct dialect separate from the rest of Michigan. The accent carries Finnish and Scandinavian influences from immigrant mining communities and produces speech patterns found nowhere else in the country. The Upper Peninsula is technically the same state as Detroit, but a linguist listening to both places would classify them as belonging to entirely different regional language communities. 54. On Christmas Eve of 1913 in Calumet, Michigan, a miners' union was holding its annual Christmas party for workers and their families in the Italian Hall building. Someone in the crowd shouted fire. There was no fire. The building was not burning. But the crowd panicked immediately and people rushed toward the single staircase leading to the exit. The crush of bodies became unsurvivable. 73 people died in the stampede. 59 of them were children who had come to a Christmas party. One false word spoken in a crowded room ended the lives of 59 kids in minutes. 55. Kalamazoo, Michigan was once the undisputed celery capital of the entire world. The soil and climate around Kalamazoo produced celery in quantities that supplied the majority of America's demand for the vegetable. Celery from Kalamazoo was shipped nationally, and the city's agricultural identity was built around that single crop. Then the industry shifted, farming moved elsewhere, and Kalamazoo moved on. And the city moved on so completely that even Kalamazoo itself largely stopped acknowledging that it ever held that title. The former celery capital of the world forgot it was the celery capital of the world. 56. Michigan is the only state in the country where driving between its own two peninsulas requires leaving Michigan entirely. The upper and lower peninsulas are connected by the Mackinac Bridge. But if a driver wants to make that crossing over land without the bridge, the only continuous land route runs directly through Wisconsin. A Michigan resident driving from one part of their own state to another part of their own state must technically enter a completely different state to complete the journey. Michigan is the only place in America where leaving your state is sometimes the only way to stay in it. 57. Motown Records started in Detroit with $800 that Berry Gordy borrowed as a personal loan. That $800 became the foundation of the most commercially successful black-owned business in American history. Artists who recorded in that small Detroit house became some of the most recognized musicians on the planet. The music that came out of Motown shaped American culture permanently. Then Berry Gordy sold the label and moved the entire operation to Los Angeles, The sound that defined Detroit was created in Detroit, perfected in Detroit, and then packed up and taken to California. 58. Sleeping Bear Dunes in Michigan contain something hidden beneath their surface that most visitors walking across the sand never think about. Entire forests are buried under those dunes. Full-grown trees were swallowed whole by the moving sand over centuries and preserved underground in conditions that kept them largely intact. The dunes that tourists climb for scenic views and photographs are sitting on top of forests that disappeared under the surface long ago and never came back up. Michigan has one of the most visited natural attractions in the Midwest, and it is secretly a giant buried woodland cemetery. 59. Detroit built an automated elevated people mover transit system in 1987, and the numbers tell the story of exactly how useful it turned out to be. The loop covered 2.9 miles of downtown track. The city it was supposed to serve sprawls across 143 square miles in every direction. The people mover connected a tiny fraction of 1% of the actual urban geography that residents needed to navigate daily. Detroit spent significant public money building a transit solution for a problem nobody had, while the actual transit problem covering the other 140 miles went completely unaddressed. 60. Michigan classified fantasy sports leagues as illegal gambling and banned them statewide for years. Residents could not legally participate in fantasy football, fantasy baseball, or any other fantasy league format while living in Michigan. Meanwhile, the state was operating its own government-run lottery system through thousands of licensed retail locations on virtually every street corner across Michigan. The state banned private citizens from running their own fantasy sports pools for money, while simultaneously selling government lottery tickets to those same citizens every single day. Michigan decided fantasy sports were illegal gambling, and government scratchers were perfectly fine public policy. 61. Michigan was the first state in American history to abolish the death penalty, and it did so in 1846. That is not a recent progressive achievement. That is a 170-year head start on a debate the rest of the country is still having today. Michigan ended capital punishment before the Civil War, before the telephone, before the light bulb, and before most of the modern world had even considered the question seriously. Despite holding this genuinely remarkable historical distinction, Michigan almost never mentions it in its own official history curricula or state identity conversations. 62. Grand Rapids. Michigan was once known across the entire world as the furniture capital of the world. That was not a casual nickname or a local boast. Grand Rapids genuinely dominated American furniture manufacturing for decades, and its reputation traveled internationally. Buyers, designers, and manufacturers around the world associated Grand Rapids with quality furniture production. Then the industry moved offshore, chasing cheaper labor and lower costs. The factories closed, the craftsmen scattered, and the title quietly disappeared from Grand Rapids without ceremony or acknowledgement. And the furniture capital of the world lost its entire industry and then lost its own memory of having had it. 63. Michigan's Tahquamenon Falls in the Upper Peninsula runs the color of root beer every single day of the year, and it has nothing to do with pollution or contamination. The water draining from cedar and hemlock swamps upstream carries natural tannins that stain the river a permanent deep amber brown before it ever reaches the falls. The result is a massive waterfall that looks like someone is pouring an enormous carbonated beverage over a ledge in the middle of a forest. Tahquamenon is one of the largest waterfalls east of the Mississippi, and it permanently looks like a fast food beverage. 64. Michigan Stadium in Ann Arbor holds over 107,000 people, making it the largest stadium in the entire Western Hemisphere. It has hosted college football games in front of crowds that would qualify as mid-sized American cities, showing up in one place on a Saturday afternoon. For decades, this enormous structure operated as one of the biggest venues in the world without installing permanent lights. Michigan filled the largest stadium in the Western Hemisphere with over 100,000 people on a regular basis and then sent everyone home before dark because the light situation had not been resolved. 65. During the Great Depression, the federal government sent civilian Conservation Corps workers into Michigan and put them to work planting trees. And those workers planted 484 million trees across the state before the program ended. Today, millions of tourists drive into Michigan, walk into those forests, and experience what feels like ancient, untouched wilderness. They photograph the trees, breathe the air, and feel the weight of nature around them. Those forests are roughly 90 years old. They were planted by unemployed Depression-era workers following government instructions. Michigan's ancient wilderness is a landscaping project from the 1930s. 66. Werner's Ginger Ale was born in Detroit in 1866 through a process that its inventor James Werner never fully planned. Werner was a pharmacist experimenting with a flavored drink when the Civil War interrupted everything and sent him off to serve. He locked his experiment in an oak barrel and left. Why 4 years later he came back, opened the barrel, and discovered that time and oak had transformed his experiment into something genuinely remarkable. He had accidentally created what became America's oldest surviving soda brand by leaving a barrel unattended during a war. Michigan's most historic beverage was invented by procrastination. 67. Michigan has 3,288 miles of freshwater coastline, which is more than any other state in the contiguous United States. That number is not close. Michigan's freshwater shoreline dwarfs states that have built entire economies and identities around being coastal destinations. Despite holding this extraordinary geographic advantage, Michigan consistently ranks low in national beach tourism awareness compared to states sitting on ocean coastlines. The state with more freshwater coast than anyone else in the lower 48 gets overlooked every summer by travelers who drive past Michigan heading towards saltwater. 68. Michigan once required businesses to purchase a paid permit to operate a jukebox in any public establishment. The permit fees were not set low. They were deliberately priced high as a form of economic protection for live musicians who were losing bookings to recorded music, playing in bars and restaurants. Michigan essentially taxed recorded music to protect human performers from technological competition. A jukebox sitting in a Michigan bar was not just a music machine. It was a licensed, regulated commercial device generating revenue for the state while simultaneously being resented by every bar owner paying the annual fee. 69. Detroit's 1967 uprising was not a riot that local police handled over a weekend. It escalated so rapidly and spread so widely across the city that the response required simultaneous deployment of both the Michigan National Guard and the United States Army. That combination made it the largest domestic military urban response since the Civil War. Tanks rolled through Detroit streets. Federal soldiers occupied American neighborhoods. The city that had spent decades producing the cars, the music, and the manufacturing output that defined post-war American prosperity required a wartime military response to address what was happening inside its own borders. 70. Michigan's copper mines in the Upper Peninsula supplied approximately 90% of all copper used by the entire Union Army during the Civil War. Cannons, ammunition, communication wire, and countless pieces of military equipment depended on copper, and Michigan was providing nearly all of it. Military historians spend enormous energy analyzing battles, generals, and strategies when discussing how the Union won the war. The copper that made the weapons, the wire, and the machinery possible came overwhelmingly from one peninsula in Michigan. The UP's mines were arguably more strategically important to the Union's survival than several famous engagements that fill history textbooks. 71. Standing in Detroit and looking directly south across the water, a person is staring into Canada. Not northeast, not northwest, due south. Windsor, Ontario sits below Detroit on every compass reading. And that geographical fact breaks the mental map that virtually every American carries about where the border with Canada actually runs. Americans grow up understanding Canada as the country above them, sitting to the north. Detroit disproves that entirely. Michigan is the only state where you can face directly south, look across open water, and be looking at a foreign country. Geography in Michigan does not follow the rules Americans assume apply everywhere else. Michigan is two peninsulas that do not touch, a city that outsnows Alaska, a breakfast cereal invented to kill your sex drive, and a state that abolished the death penalty before the light bulb existed. The dumbest state in America, or just the most misunderstood one? Drop your answer in the comments right now. If this video made you feel something, hit that like button, subscribe to Dumbest Things, and we will see you in the next state.